Welcome to Reading with the Pastor. We're on to chapter 6 of Gentle and Lowly, Dane Ortland's book, and we're glad you've been joining us. I'm Pastor Adam Tisdale of North Hills Presbyterian Church, or North Hills Church in Meridianville, Alabama, just north of Huntsville. And you are?
I'm Jacob Hale, pastoral intern here in North Hills.
Okay, so we're glad to have you, but
I've got a question for you before we start.
Okay, you've got a question this time.
Yes, I've got a question this time.
Okay, all right, let's go.
Yeah. My question is, well, for those of you who don't know, in the Presbyterian tradition, there are two books that are extremely highly regarded and cherished.
Okay.
That is Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yes, absolutely.
Yep,
Love
yep,
them.
yep. My question to you is, which one is your favorite?
Ooh. All right, bringing the heavy-hitting questions. This one's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to say, just thinking, the sentimental part of me, which is not insignificant, I want to say Chronicles of Narnia.
Mm. That
That would be the sentimental part of me. But if you were nailing me down, I would have to pick Lord of the Rings for the rest of me.
Mm.
And that's also not insignificant. So, Lord of the Rings, what about you?
Yeah, Lord of the Rings as well for me.
Okay.
Yeah, I became a Christian when I was a little bit later in my teens, and I didn't really read Chronicles of Narnia until later, and so it just didn't sit as well. I was a little too old for it. I mean, still love it, still really enjoy it, but Lord of the Rings hit right at that same, so I'm a bit of a nerd anyways, and so the fantasy setting, the swords, everything, just, yeah.
There's
really spoke to me.
Swords in Chronicles of Narnia.
And not as many.
Not as many, fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, if you're offended by the answer we just gave to that question, where can people lodge their deepest complaint?
Yeah, you can tell us how wrong we are by sending an email to reading@northhillschurch.net.
All right. So we'll see if we get any listener complaints. Well, let's dig into Gentle and Lowly, chapter 6, and I have to say this has been my favorite chapter so far. And it is titled, I Will Never Cast Out, which is based on John 6:37, when Jesus is speaking and saying, whoever comes to me, I will never cast out, John 6:37. And so Ortland just takes off. He's pulling on some thoughts from John Bunyan, reflecting on Jesus' words here. And it addresses, at least in some part, a theology or a doctrine that we would identify as perseverance of the saints. Mm-hmm. That's certainly a part of this discussion, and that got you thinking a little bit, didn't it?
Yeah, so he spends a good time discussing perseverance of the saints, or you might know a similar doctrine, once saved, always saved, mm-hmm. is another way people talk about it, or eternal security. Basically, that those who are saved will never leave the faith. And he's talking about it, and I really like what he said, because when you're talking about once saved, always saved, I don't like that terminology, mm-hmm. because it almost treats it as like a flu shot, okay. or like a fire insurance, or like a club. Once you're in, and nothing mm-hmm. you can do gets you out, which is true to an extent, but it's almost like a bad, just something you do.
It's missing
right.
a good bit, right?
Yeah, it's not as deep as the Bible really presents this doctrine.
Yes.
And so in the Presbyterian tradition, we talk about perseverance of the saints, which is, I think, is better terminology and really reflects more what the Bible talks about it. We're called to work out our faith with fear and trembling, and that God will cause us to persevere. But at the same time, when I think of persevere, I think of, trudging along, getting back at it, bearing down, working hard through it.
Getting to work.
Yeah, getting to work. Which, as I said, part of our salvation, part of our sanctification is working. But what he says here really, really hit me, and he says it on page, I believe I got it written down out here. He says on page 66, and he's talking about the doctrine, he says, but within the skeletal structure of these doctrines, what is the beating heart of God made tangible in Christ? What is most deeply instinctive to him as our sins and sufferings pile up? What keeps him from growing cold? The answer is his heart. That's what's at the heart of the perseverance of the saints. It's not that we are either get this flu shot, or that we keep a white knuckle grip on our faith and bear down and keep going no matter what. It's that Christ keeps a white knuckle grip on us. It's that it's in his heart, and his love for us keeps us in the faith, and that he will make us persevere. And so all this doctrine, which can be kind of skewed and have connotations that is not quite right, really points us to Christ's heart.
Yeah. And we want to cling to Christ.
Yeah.
That's something that's part of what the role of the church is, right? To encourage and equip us to do that. And yet, that's not the most important thing. It's His grip on us. Right? His clinging to us.
He gives another little example of his son, who's 2 years old, and talks about going into a pool, and his son is so scared of the water, he's holding onto his dad's hand, but he says, once we get deep enough, his grip is not strong enough to keep him there.
Right.
He's gripping, he's clinging, but it's only because the Father holds him that he's secure. And the same is true for us. We cling to Christ, but our grip is weak and failing and slips a lot at times.
And sometimes because of our sin, and sometimes because of our suffering.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Sometimes because we have decided we know a better way than God, which is our foolishness, and sometimes because we live in a fallen world and we experience difficult things. In both cases, we can come at this and think, well, surely that's the thing that is either going to cause us to be lost or is evidence of it. That either this will be the thing that finally tips Christ over the edge to say, I'm done with you, or we're looking at the sufferings that we're experiencing and thinking, okay, it's happened, because I can't see anything else.
Yeah.
And so this verse and this chapter was driving us back to the heart of Christ and what He says in view of what we might say to Him. Could we throw anything up to Christ? Could we suggest any reason or any cause that would lead to Him saying, I will cast you out? And what's the answer?
No. And he says it so beautifully. Page 66, I believe. He's talking about all the objections we do raise, or we can raise. And he says, raise your objections. And Christ responds with these, he says, invincible words.
Invincible words.
I love that. That's a great way to put it. Invincible words, I will never cast out.
And that was where that idea of raising objections, as my mind and heart were comforted by this reality that whether because of my sin or in view of my sufferings, which are both significant, that in whatever I'm wrestling with and whatever I'm struggling to think through, that those are, and that was kind of the head and heart side of things, that then where I'm moved is to, as you said, to raise my objections. That, we've talked about prayer before and our coming before Christ, but I felt like this was another wrinkle to how my prayers take shape, opening another vein, if you will, to pour out before God, to say, I can bring those objections, and I should.
Yeah.
I also want to listen. I want to listen well to what Christ says to those objections.
Yes. I mean, the Psalms are full of that kind of language, right? I mean, you look at some of the Psalms David and other psalmists wrote, I will pour out my complaints before you. I'll tell my troubles to your face. Answer me, Lord. How long, O Lord? Like, they're full of that kind of objections and pouring out what we feel and what we think, but in a manner that's wanting to listen to God and trusting Him.
And the obvious is somewhat stated by Bunyan, as Ortlund pulls on Bunyan's thoughts here on this verse early on, that unless we had, Jesus is not just saying that to say it. He's saying it because we need to hear it.
Yeah, exactly.
We need to hear it. Was there something else that got you thinking about how we should respond in action? Yeah,
I think so. Again, talking about not casting people out. And one of the examples he gives of being cast out that we have personal experience with, is in our friendships and relationships, and how in our friendships with other people, we can sin or be sinned against so much that the relationship breaks, that walls go up, that there's distance invoked, but with Christ, obviously, that's not true. He's always our friend. He will never cast us out, and that was his point. But as I was thinking about that, I was also thinking about the example that gives to us, and how we are to conduct ourselves in our friendships and relationships.
Okay.
And when my friends and people sin against me, my first response is either to, well, get back at them,
Right.
or cut them off. Well, you're not my friend anymore, or whatever it may be. But Christ's example, I think, sets us a precedent for how we view our relationships, how we act those out, and learning to respond more with grace, learning to respond more with forgiveness, and instead of that immediate knee-jerk reaction of walls going up and distances,
Sure.
going to them and forgiving them and loving them through that difficulty. And I mean, let's face it, all your friends are sinners. All my friends are sinners.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, that's going to happen. You're going to be sinned against in friendship.
Right.
It's not going to work out well. So we need to.
And that's not a call to stay in an abusive
Oh, no.
setting or I know you're not saying that, but just simply what I hear you saying is the deeper we know Christ's perseverance with us, or as we Christ would say, as I've forgiven you,
Exactly.
therefore forgive others.
Yeah, this should have an impact on our relationships.
Okay, absolutely. Agree with you. Well, once again, this was my favorite chapter so far, although I have a feeling I'll probably say that about a later chapter. But again, this was chapter 6, and thank you for joining us. I hope this has been encouraging for you just to listen to us. Hope you're reading, but even if you're not, we hope there's something encouraging here for you to take away from this.